Well wishes. I'm Dr. Dana E. Crawford, and through Thrive NYC, I have the privilege of speaking with you today about diversity, equity, inclusion, and employee mental health. Now, before I get into the thick of this presentation today, I want to start with a bit of a caveat. This presentation offers an opportunity to go beyond introductory level diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts by really zooming in on the intersection of these concepts with workplace mental health. If you are looking for an introductory level course, I invite you to just simply go through Google. There are so many wonderful things that have been done in the field of multiculturalism, cultural competency, workplace diversity. This training is going to briefly provide an introductory level overview, but then we're going to get really, really deep into things. More specifically, I'm going to give you a background on these topics. Then I'm going to briefly but very quickly go through some definitions so we have a shared language. I'm going to talk about the prevalence of bias, prejudice, and racism and the impact on mental health. But then I'm going to spend most of our time today on diversity and bias in the workplace. And I think most importantly, developing strategies to identify and disrupt bias, prejudice, and racism in the workforce. Now, anyone who elected to participate in this webinar, I'm making some assumptions about you as the audience today. I'm going to assume that some part of you, if not every part of you, does not want to have bias, prejudice, and racism living inside of you, or even living in the world. You also have some desire to work in a diverse work setting. You want to feel safe at work so you can be the best employee you can. And you also don't want to make anyone else feel unsafe. In short, you value diversity. Unfortunately, that value alone is not going to be sufficient in supporting diversity in the workplace. And there's a couple of reasons why that we must address. The first is that the traditional approaches to multiculturalism, although I am very thankful for all of the scholars and experts and researchers in the field of cultural competency and diversity, we're challenged to move to the next level of this work. The first wave did things like otherize. And what that means is you would open up a multicultural book or go to a diversity training, and the training topics would be things like how to work with African Americans, how to work with Asian Americans, how to work with LGBTQIA, gender values and support. I even saw a chapter that was understanding Asian deaf communities. I have yet to see the book that says how to work with white folks, or even more specifically, how to work with white heterosexual men. And so what this does is it positions, because this chapter is not named, it positions whiteness, white maleness, white male heterosexuality as the norm, and everything else is to be understood from that lens as different. In short, otherizing. The next piece is whiteness, because things are otherized, whiteness as a race and a culture goes underexplored. And on the occasion that it is explored, it's explored within the lens of white supremacy. We have to move away from that and start exploring all cultures and not have an other lens. The next problem is, quite often, people with a minority status are the experts on these diversity topics and not the learners, which results in intracultural bias being perpetuated because individuals with minority status are rarely given the opportunity to explore and examine and reduce our own experiences of bias, prejudice, and racism. The next point is, honestly, I've gone to so many diversity trainings only to leave feeling pretty guilty about the privileges that I have in this world as a cis woman, as a doctor, as a person who is privileged to have gone to college. And so I leave with all that guilt, sometimes shame, and I have all this increased awareness to my next point without any concrete action steps to change the behaviors they made me so aware of. Finally, these conversations often end in a presentation the presenter saying something like, and cultural competency is a lifelong journey that we will never achieve. And as a person who did all the school, telling me I'm never going to achieve something isn't particularly motivating, especially in a fast-paced work environment where there are clear expectations of things that need to be met. And so, as a result, everyone's supporting diversity, but yet diversity and discrimination continue to coexist. And the reason for this is often that just having a diverse setting isn't going to cut it. Discrimination, those experiences that happened for your employees before they came to work with you, that happened to them on their way to work, that happened to them on the way home, that maybe even happened to them in the parking garage or in the elevator, impacts the ways that they interact with other people. Discrimination, those experiences of bias, prejudice, and racism, it impacts the way that people feel comfortable in the space that they're in. And if it's about comfort, sometimes people are not going to network, which is going to limit the opportunities they can access. Unfortunately, this is also associated with some pretty intense mental health challenges, such as trauma, stress, and depression. And these things produce negative emotions, such as self-blame, decreased self-esteem, shame, fear, and guilt. And so we have these spaces that are well-intentioned, but yet valuing diversity is insufficient. You're going to need a little bit more if your workplace is going to be successful. And so let's talk a little bit more about a shared language, because I've said a lot of words and I haven't defined them. So really quickly, so we're on the same page and we're talking about the same thing. I'm going to define a few of these terms for you. Bias, it's subjective. It's our preconceived notions. Freud said when a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a therapist enters the therapeutic relationship with a patient, they are to be a blank slate, or rather a tabula rasa. The reality is we wish to be such, but we are not objective. It's really hard to maintain objectivity because our entire worldview is based on our worldview and the things that we've experienced in our lives in ways that we're not even aware of. It's unconscious. It's our attitudes, our stereotypes, and it may be both favorable and unfavorable, and it's activated involuntarily without our awareness or our intentional control. Prejudice, this is the evaluation or the emotional response that we have towards a social group because of our preconceived notions, because of our preconceptions. And these expressions are often regulated based on our own personal beliefs and the social norms that we have been taught. What is socially normal? And so the prevalence of these things, every person has to, if they aim to be productive and to get things done in a timely way, has to create shortcuts for getting things done. If you labored over every single decision in your life, you wouldn't get things done. So if you were to think through getting out of the bed, which foot to put down on the floor first, what's the fastest, the best, most efficient way to get to your bathroom in the morning, you would probably have a lot of problems. And so the brain, after repeated exposure, develops heuristics and shortcuts and quick ways of developing decisions and establishing behaviors. The same is true based on race and ethnicity and gender and socioeconomic status and beauty and weight and so many different cultural identity points, both visible and invisible. We make these decisions about people. And because we do these things, sometimes they're based inaccurately on our own personal experiences. But it's normal. It's part of the human experience. It doesn't make you a bad person. It's just how human brains work. Unfortunately, the prevalence of this has real impacts. So we know that communities of color make up 65% of New York's population, yet often have underaddressed mental health needs, as well as having difficulty accessing appropriate care due to the ways that structures create inequities. So we create all of these structures for us to live in, these heuristics and shortcuts, and they result in real consequences. Bias, prejudice, and racism, it's everywhere. If you're breathing, you're gonna get some bias all up in your lungs. And so instead of thinking about your intentions, that you didn't mean it, instead, I invite us to think about the impact. We'll go more into that later. But first, let's talk about how did we get bias, prejudice, and racism inside? Some have called it a socially transmitted disease. And that's because it's influenced by our backgrounds, our cultural environment, our personal experiences. It's also our biased media representations. How many of you use social media? And right now, your social media is pretty representative of the people you've known in your life. How many of you have social media friends that are strangers? Not many of us, if they're not celebrities, which is also based on our preferences. And so those representations in our social media, in our news, in the billboards in the neighborhood we live in the commercials we see, in the stores we shop in the packaging, the pictures literally on the packages on our cereal and our baby food. Our entire world is a curated cultural experience. And so those social experiences repeat and they reinforce, and then they develop stereotypes. And over time, they become our automatic heuristics and our long-term memory. But I'm not just talking about one type of racism, prejudice, and bias. There are many forms. And if we think there is only one form, we tend to be very limited in our understanding. More specifically, the first type is individual or personal racism. What I'm talking about here are the thoughts in your head. And so if you're not walking around thinking, I'm better than this person because I'm white, I'm better than this person because I'm Indian, I'm better than this person because I'm Mexican. If someone was to say you're racist and this is the only concept of racism that you've been exposed to, you might become very offended. Like, I would never think that. We already know everyone on this webinar is good people. You know, we're all trying to do our best. And so you would be very offended because you're not actively thinking those things. However, there's more racism to come. Interpersonal racism, if you recall, just a few moments ago, I talked about those long-term memories and those stereotypes we developed. Interpersonal racism has to do with how that manifests in the world. All those experiences are going to come up and you're interacting with someone maybe you haven't had a lot of experience with. Maybe you've seen a TV show with someone with this background, or you have one or two friends from school that you know, and that's how you're basing your stereotypes. And so when you interact with this person, you enter that space with some beliefs on where they belong in the world, because we're all really busy, right? We just talked about that. So an example of this might be when you're looking at a Black woman and you're wondering, how did she become the CEO of this company? I'm wondering if it had something to do with, discrimination, reverse discrimination, or these concepts that make us believe that people aren't qualified because of their race or their gender. That's interpersonal racism. And you might not say that to the person, but it is going to be felt in the interaction that you have because you're questioning them. You might be less friendly. You might be challenging of their authority because you don't believe they've earned it. The next is institutional racism. And these are the ways that the institution expects and does things differently. And all things about racism is positioning people in certain places and not allowing them to have free access to who they are most capable of being in the world. And so, an example of institutional racism, and I think it's a very timely one, looking at where our country is now with protests and this new wave of civil rights movements. This has to do with things like, for example, now many organizations are developing diversity and inclusion and equity committees, but they're expecting Black employees to volunteer to be a part of these things without any incentive, without any financial compensation, or even the time to not only participate in the group or the committee, but also to recover, because these spaces are highly emotional. And so you're in the workplace opening up these emotional things. But yet, it's possible that your institution historically does incentivize other types of committee work, but yet aren't doing that for your diversity and inclusion and equity work. That's a form of institutional racism. Cultural racism has to do with the policies that are put in place related to professionalism that only impact particular groups of people. So, for instance, making comments about braids, dreadlocks, or other Black hairstyles as professional or not professional, when traditionally Black employees might be the majority of the people wearing their hair in this way. And so, to police hair is a form of racism because it often does not police white hair or other ethnic hair. There's a movement called the Crown Act, I invite you to Google it, that talks about not policing people's hair and making policies that perpetuate cultural racism. Lastly, structural and systemic racism. A good example of this, and there are so many, because so many structures within our country have been developed in ways that started out to exclude women, Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color. But a good example I think of is not necessarily based on race, but it might also be based on socioeconomic status. So if your organization prioritizes unpaid internship as part of the hiring practice, what that might do is for any group of people that have not had the privilege to have generational wealth, that puts them at a disadvantage because they haven't had the privilege of working for free. You have to be pretty financially flexible or have an entire support system to be able to work for free. And so if your hiring practices prioritizes this, you're already going to do things. It's already going to set it up that it doesn't support diversity. Now, all of us as good people, you're hearing all of this and now maybe you have an increased awareness. I imagine you already knew many of these things, and that's the background and review piece. But there are certain factors that even with all the awareness you have are going to increase the likelihood that racism, prejudice, and bias are going to show up at the workplace. So first, working under the time pressure, because you don't have time to dissect and be reflective of your implicit bias. You're keeping it moving. The next is vague and confusing situations. If you don't have all the information, you're going to fill in the gaps with your own history, which is going to put you at risk for bias, prejudice, and racism. The next is too much information at once. If it's cognitive overload, then you're going to just discern what is the most important thing based, again, on your own history and your own knowledge. And that may not be accurate to the person sharing the information. The next is a lack of attention being paid to the task. If you're working under time pressure, cognitive overload, vague situation, and you're trying to multitask, of course, your heuristics are going to show up and you're going to just automatically go into autopilot, and that autopilot may be unconscious bias. Lastly, in a position of privilege, you have the decision. If you have privilege, you get to decide if this is relevant or not. The very privilege to say, yes, diversity matters. No, I'm colorblind. That is a privilege. And also, if you have that privilege related to hierarchy, so if you're a hiring manager, people can't really say no if they want a job there. If you do evaluations, people can't say no if they want a promotion or a bonus. Or if you have a privileged identity, because people that have identities that are historically oppressed are going to be at a disadvantage and may also feel like they don't have the power to push back on the experiences that the person with privilege may be bringing. And I want to be clear because I've said the word privilege several times. Privilege does not mean you haven't faced hardships. Obviously, everyone has had some difficulty. Your life may be very, very challenging, and you may have a story that is worthy of a television show. I'm not saying that that's not true. That can be true, and you can still have privilege. Privilege just means that the reason you've had those hardships aren't because of your skin color, they're not because of your gender, it's not because of your sexual orientation. Those aren't the things making your life harder. And maybe other things that make your life harder. We all have challenges, but privilege is that it's not based on the body that you're living in. And part of that privilege has to do with the reality that historically in the United States, in New York City, in the world, there are groups that have been socially oppressed, and there are groups that are socially privileged. And obviously, there is an overlap, hence the Venn diagram. And it's important that we recognize that although these groups may be fluent, they're also, they have been pretty historically stable over time. For instance, we continue to see women make less money than men. We see that persons with a disability are often not represented equally within organizations. And we continue to see other ways that oppression and privilege continue. And so many people have made the argument that they're culturally unbiased, they're colorblind, they don't see these things. And first, if you're colorblind, please go to the doctor because that's a problem and you should probably get that checked out. But I say that in jest, but in all seriousness, what I really want us to consider is why would that be a good thing to not see the differences, not to celebrate the unique beauty of culture. Culture, as I like to say, is a silent participant in every interaction. And so if you believe you are having meaningful interactions and culture does not come up in those interactions, I can assure you that you are not seeing the totality of that person that you're interacting with. And you're really missing the opportunity to have a more in depth and meaningful interaction when you see the whole person. The truth is bias is everywhere. It's in our schools, it's in our workforce, it's in our businesses, our religious organizations, it's in medicine. We see countless studies just in medicine alone that look at Black maternal mortality rates related to childbirth. We see it in our relationships, we see it in our government. All you have to do is turn on the news, put on your social media, talk with some of your family member that are of different generations than your own. Look around at your services, your religious services, even in the school outcomes. There's no place that is safe from bias because it's a human condition. And it impacts all of our lives, our health, our behaviors, our interactions, our relationships, how we do our jobs, our organization. And we see it not just on the day to day, we see it in hiring practices, We see it in outcomes and deliverables. One of the most alarming studies that I've looked at is the ways that even in hiring practices, we see applicants with white sounding names receive 50% more callbacks than applicants with the exact same resume. This is in a study where they just changed the name on the resume. 50% more callbacks than Black sounding names. We've known that credentials from an elite university results in more employer responses for all candidates, if you go to a really prestigious institution. However, Black candidates from elite universities only do as well as white candidates from less selective universities. And so race really does result in a double penalty. So after all of those things, and that Black employee, that Black candidate is called back, they're offered a lower starting salary and a less prestigious position than their white peers. And ironically, in the example of interpersonal racism that I shared, I talked about questioning a Black person when they are in a position of authority. It's interesting how that might work when you think about these statistics. And there are many types of workforce discrimination, workplace discrimination. And these are all protected by the EEOC, but there are other forms as well. And so what does that mean? Knowing all of these things, I think it's really crucial that we know what we're up against if we're striving to have a workforce that not only supports diversity, but also wants to be a place of healthy mental experiences, mental health, or I like to say mental wealth. We want our organizations to have employees that are mentally healthy, that results in wealth and prosperity. And so prejudice, bias, and racism, they impact recruiting, like I just mentioned, hiring decisions, mentoring and training opportunities. And I have to say, as a member of an organization that I'm one of the few Black employees, I get countless emails and requests from Black trainees and residents and interns asking me to be their mentor. And my organization doesn't incentivize that. I just end up working a lot more hours, evenings, weekends, and it's exhausting, meaningful, but yet exhausting. Assignments regarding jobs and tasks, feedback, suggestions, and so forth. And some of those manifestations, it's not just that these things impact the workforce, it's also how it shows up. And so it's things like negative changes in workload, unfair promotions, or assignment of work. So when I talked about doing a volunteer group for diversity and inclusion and equity, but yet not volunteer groups for other parts of your organization, like quality improvement, those things are incentivized. It's unfair, it's bias. It's also about the assumptions about abilities. It's things related to age, race, gender, and we all know the unequal compensation and benefits if we just look at women alone. And so these things impact us. We can be very aware of these occurrences, and that alone has an impact. It's not as if we just shake it off. At the least, it causes us stress. But there are studies that show that discrimination can result in the common cold, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and mortality. So a Black female doctor is 3 to 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than a white woman. And the only difference is race discrimination. And so that's just one example, but we see just recently in COVID, we see COVID impacting Brown and Black communities more. It is clear that discrimination has an impact on not only the body, but also the mind and the mental health challenges. Who could go to work every day in these environments and see these things? Growing up in a household, seeing your family members have these experiences, seeing your friends have these experiences, having them yourself, you start to wonder, is it something wrong with me? You may have self-blame, decreased self-esteem, somatic symptoms, so backache, stomach aches, a headache. This stuff is exhausting. Depression, anxiety, of course, who wouldn't be worried? It's traumatizing, shame, and fear. And these factors are not just about employees that are Black and Indigenous people or other people of color. It also impacts your white workforce because we all see it. The more aware we are, but we don't have skills to change it, we're going to all have mental health challenges. Everyone has to have a seat at the table to discuss these things. We are in these topics together. And so when we think about discrimination and bias in the workplace, why is diversity alone insufficient? Why? Why is this? I hope I've answered it somewhat. But if you just, take a minute, take a breath, and just think of all the things that I've said. And an employee is walking into an organization, regardless of what body they live in, knowing all of these factors, and if you've ever been on, I guess in more recent time, a virtual call, but in a meeting and a cultural rupture happens, even if you're not involved, it's embarrassing. If you're the person who said the wrong thing, you feel shame. If you're the person who was microaggressed or the person who was hurt, you don't know if you can advocate because you have fear that you'll be fired. As an organization, you don't know what to do. You're worried that you're going to be sued. On a bigger picture in just the world, walking down the street, driving, living in this world, our country sometimes feels like it's about to implode related to racism, prejudice, and bias, especially in the last, month and a half. We have created this culture that people are really afraid of saying the wrong thing because they're going to be punished, and the punishment isn't just having to do with self-esteem. People are worried about being assaulted or killed, regardless of what side of the argument, what side of the debate or perspective that they're having. These have real impact. And the truth of it is, we've shifted from having differences in beliefs to literally having contempt for people who have different political views than us, contempt, disgust. And so, how is the workplace, how is it supposed to be this place of safety when this is the atmosphere of the world that employees are living in? And so, it's exhausting and we become really fragile. We've become so fragile that just the minimal amount of cultural stress in the workforce starts to feel like it is intolerable, it is too triggering, and we become really defensive. And so it results in anger, fear, guilt, arguing, silencing, just kind of shutting down, and just leaving the stress inducing situation. People check out. And then the workforce becomes a place where these topics are off limits. And so, we've become fragile in general, but there's also white fragility. And somewhere along the way, to talk about white fragility specifically, but fragility in general, somewhere along the way, and I think it may have come from the colorblind movement of the 80s, somewhere we thought that issues of racism, prejudice, and bias, talking about them should be comfortable. Racism is not just decades long, it is centuries long as a historical human condition. But yet we think we should be comfortable in talking about this. And then any discomfort should be avoided. We have uncomfortable conversations all the time at work about promotions, about money, about hiring and firing, but yet we're supposed to be so comfortable. That's the requirement. And if it is uncomfortable, it's a bad thing and it's intolerable. And lastly, if you are uncomfortable, somewhere we believe that it is the job of the person who is from that socially oppressed group to make the person from the socially privileged group feel comfortable. And that's fragility. And it's actually a myth. We are more than capable of tolerating discomfort. Believe that you can because you do it in other parts of your job all the time. But somehow we became convinced that because racism is on the table, the big scary R word, that we couldn't tolerate it. In truth, we are all walking around with multiple cultural identities. And the more we recognize our multiple identities, the better equipped we're going to be to have these conversations related to racism, prejudice, and bias. And the reason we become more aware by recognizing our multicultural identity is because then we have a reference point. Oh, I have a political affiliation. Oh, I have a gender. And so even if your race and your ethnicity is not your most defined multicultural identity, recognize you have others and lean into that knowledge to build your knowledge in the other circles or the other wheels that are not as developed. So what happens over time because of our heuristics, because of the ways that we've been exposed to things, we start to engage in these microaggressions. And one of my favorite scholars, Dr. Chester Pierce, a psychiatrist, he's coined with actually making the term microaggressions, and he's credited for much of the diversity work in the early days of Sesame Street. And he talked about like these micro insults and dismissals in which he regularly witnessed in non-Black Americans experienced by Black people. Fast forward to, I think I read the really critical article, and Dr. Subi came on my radar in his amazing article in the American Psychologist, I think it was in 2007, in which he really popularized microaggressions as these everyday slights and indignities that people encounter all the time, not just Black folks, not just white, not just in the hands of white people, but all people are engaging in these micro ways of interacting. And I think it's really nice to think about it this way as microaggressions because, you know, it's not the big scary racism of our great-great-grandparents or our grandparents, or even if you grew up in the 60s or different parts of the world, different times. These are just the everyday slights that us well-intentioned, us well-meaning, us good people on this webinar all engage in. And he talks about microaggressions as slights, but also having a macro impact. So they're microaggressions, but they have a big impact over time because they wear away at our confidence, our self-esteem, and overall our functioning in the workplace. And so these microaggressions, the reason it's important to point them out is if you're aiming to support a diverse workforce, if the staff are engaging in these microaggressions, it's going to start to create tension and people are not going to feel included, and it's going to limit the ways that your staff is able to come together to produce outcomes and deliverables and beautiful work. And so the consequences of diversity without addressing microaggressions, without thinking about equity, without thinking about inclusion, but you're just diversifying, is one, it creates this false sense of fairness. So if I believe like, oh, I'm colorblind, everyone is equal, and I'm creating this diverse environment that is visually diverse or diverse on paper, then it makes you believe that everything is fair. But in reality, everything is not fair. We talked about socially oppressed groups and socially privileged groups, and that history is real. And so we could believe in fairness, but it doesn't exist. So we just have to kind of like name the thing. The other part is if you're not leaning in and acknowledging the larger pictures and the larger part of the world, you might have blind spots. And it just makes us more likely to have bias because it's not on our radar. If you believe I have no bias, then it makes you more likely to have bias. Also, you may successfully, on paper, diversify your workforce, and they may come in, but presenteeism, where people are physically there, but they're not bringing their most inspired self, is a consequence when they feel like the organization is not really being true to the diversity and inclusion and equity mission. That also results in high turnover. You'll have a very young staff, and institutional knowledge is a critical part to propel an organization into the next level of functioning. The workforce becomes really tense because people feel like they have to walk on eggshells. And finally, it's burnout. People just get over it. And I think that burnout piece is so crucial as we talk about mental health and also diversity, because people get tired of the conversation. And the reason they get tired of the conversation is because they don't have the skills and change doesn't happen. And so we have to be leaning into the goals that we have of equity and inclusion. And so, just to be really clear, when I talk about equity versus equality, so equality is that every single person, and this is the myth of fairness, it is fair that everyone gets a pair of pants, to use a metaphor. Everyone gets the same size of pants, regardless of their height, their weight, the climate that they live in. So maybe it's 100 degrees where they are, and they're going to get wool pants. Everyone gets wool pants regardless of their religion. Maybe they don't even wear pants in their religion or their body. Maybe they're a veteran and they don't have legs, and so they might not need pants. And it really focuses on equality, that color blindness focuses on rules and fairness. Equity, on the other hand, says everyone gets clothing based on what they need. It focuses on how can we include everyone and how can we be as efficient as possible. So equity has those goals rather than on rules and fairness. And if people's needs are being met and people are included and things are effective, it's going to decrease all of these things that I talked about around, the false sense of fairness, blind spots, presenteeism, high turnover, tense work environment, and burnout, because people will feel seen with equity. And so the goal with equity is to focus on the impact and not on intentions. So, for instance, if I'm focused on my intention, say I'm driving down my street and I accidentally, somebody has their bike in the middle of the road and I have run it over and I didn't mean to. I can say over and over again, I didn't mean to run over your bike. I didn't mean to do that. I'm so sorry. But what I'm doing is focusing on me. And you know what the person whose bike is run over doesn't have? A bike to ride. And so I still have to focus on the impact, regardless of my intention. They still need a whole new bike. And so when we get into the conversations about supporting diversity, it is crucial that we focus on the needs of your organization rather than the intentions. Because, we can have all the knowledge about racism, prejudice, and bias, which is crucial if you're going to change. And that knowledge is wonderful. However, it must be motivated. The system, the individual must be motivated for this process of change to happen. And we know that knowledge plus deliberate action, deliberate effort will result in change with motivation. And so there are 5 strategies that I recommend to identify and disrupt bias in the workforce. First is what we just discussed: impact. Focus on impact rather than intention of actions and policy. Next, reframe the conversation to focus on inclusion, on equity, and respect, and away from those ideas of equality and color blindness. These things of equality and color blindness are defense mechanisms when people feel attacked, when they feel like racism makes them a bad person, they become defensive. And so instead, when you hear your staff saying these words, it's an invitation for you to reframe. The next is really start to get some data. Gather feedback to understand your employees' experience. Fund. Use money in a way that reflects your values. If you value diversity, show it. Incentivize diversity and inclusion work. Also, possibly make it part of your annual evaluation that you want to see your employees reflecting your values in the work that they're doing. How is it showing up? And have it as part of their evaluation. Lastly, improve. Create a culture and a statement that we are not 100% there, but also it doesn't have to be that conversation of we're never going to arrive like the cultural competency work. Instead, a culture of good, better, best. I will not rest until my good gets better and my better gets best. So, in trying to get our minds to shift from all of this information, at this point, your mind is very full of so many terms. Our goal is for us to be more mindful so we can be strategic in the things that we're striving for in the workplace and to be able to start to create optimal mental health for your employees. So the first is that it's going to require us to let up on our bias, prejudice, and racism. And that's listening, not to just the person in front of you, but listening to your experience and knowing who you are. So then you're able to hear the person and not your bias. The next is empathizing with the fact that we are all infected with the socially transmitted disease that is bias, prejudice, and racism. And when you're able to empathize with yourself and say, oh, me, that's where you learn that thing from. Whew, you feeling defensive. Oh, me, it's okay. Then you're able to empathize with others. What I have found is whenever there's a movement and people become opposed to that movement and they start to list their own sufferings, it's because they don't feel seen. It's because their hurt hasn't been heard. And so it's going to be crucial that you encourage your employees to think about what their needs are so then they can focus on the needs of everyone. The next is telling your story. And this is requiring a brave space. It's going to require you to have courage. This is that motivation part. This is when we start to get really active. So the listening and the empathizing, that's something that happens internally. The telling your story with I statements, I feel, this means, our goals here are, that's going to require very actively engaging in disclosure. The next is understanding. Understanding the impact rather than focusing on your intentions. And lastly, it's providing psychoeducation. And it's really about making it clear that you as an organization, you as an individual, you as a system will name what is happening. You're not going to just look at the elephant in the room. You're going to say, this is a space where we do not collude with bias, prejudice, and racism. We are going to name the thing, we're going to say it as it is, and we're going to strive to get good, then we're going to get better, and then we're going to get best. And so when you're trying to support diversity and create safety in the workplace, who gets to define what is safe? So the person who is safe can say over and over and over again, this is a safe space. We support diversity. Everyone is supported here. But you know who gets to define if the space is safe? The person who is in danger. They get to decide. And so if you're an employee and you're not feeling particularly safe and you want to communicate that to your employer, to your coworkers, to your supervisor, here's some language you might choose to use, especially if you're experiencing that trauma, that anxiety, that depression, that fear of punishment that we talked about. You might say something like this: I need some time and space with this. Can we discuss this further in our next meeting? One of the biggest problems with racism, prejudice, and bias is that we believe we're supposed to solve it all in one conversation and then it's done. When the conversation gets so intense that your mind is so full that you can't be mindful and strategic, it's a time to take a break. You do not schedule or base the meeting based on how long the Outlook calendar or whatever your calendar invite time is. You base it on the productivity of the meeting. So if you're 10 minutes in and it's getting too intense, take a break. The next thing you might say is, thank you. So you're validating. You're saying what you're saying to me matters. Thank you for raising this issue. I value, again, more validation. That's letting your employees, that's letting your supervisee feel seen. I value your perspective. This is telling your supervisor, I value your perspective, but I'm not ready to process this. I can't go into it. The last piece is, and this is a high level of vulnerability, I worry that you will not understand my perspective and my experience, so I cannot share this. And that's okay. It's called a boundary. This is a critical piece to having optimal mental health. It's creating boundaries around areas that you do not feel safe and respected. Now, say you're an ally and you want to support diversity. You want to invite the person who feels unsafe to maybe think about safety in a different way. These are some ways you can offer the invitation. You might say something like this: I have biases. We all do. And I do not want those biases to hurt you. Can we work together to discuss this further? And if they say, no, I'm not ready, you respect that no. It's an invitation. That means they can accept it or decline it. It's not a demand. The next thing is inviting more people. And I think this is something that is so great because it empowers, because you have a witness. One of the things that happens with racism, prejudice, and bias is that it's very disorienting because we're good people. We're not doing, horrific racism. It's micro, although it has a macro impact. And so it's really disorienting. Did that really happen? Did I understand it right? These are questions that make you start to worry and say, oh, am I being over the top? Am I anxious? These are all the mental health triggers. So inviting someone in really does validate things. The next is, you might say, and this goes back to the point on the last slide, we do not have to figure out all of this today. Let's just start with what feels the most important and or the least tender. So you're allowing the person to guide the conversation. This type of language helps create the foundations of safety, mental health in the workforce. And so our goal is always to focus on the experience, not if you agree. You don't have to agree to understand someone's perspective. Some reflecting questions as you kind of guide through this work. And I want to give you some action steps. So when you leave this webinar, you have some things that you can do next. And it's really to start creating spaces for these conversations. And you're not going to have the skills if you just listen to this webinar, but you don't leave it and actually move your jaw and start practicing. And it's not going to be smooth. It's going to be clunky and awkward until you practice it more and more, and then it'll become smoother. It's good, better, best. And so some questions to just kind of guide you, because this work is hard and none of us went to school to learn how to have these conversations. I didn't. There wasn't a program when I went to grad school on how to have challenging cross-cultural, intercultural conversations and repair cultural ruptures and creating the optimal mental health workforce. Wouldn't that have been an amazing class? And so some guiding points for you. What are my values? What are your values around the intersection of diversity, equity, inclusion, and mental health? What matters to you? What would you want your colleague to know, to do, to feel? What are your goals here? What would keep you from speaking up, living your values? So you answer that first question, but what keeps you from it? The next is, what do you need to do to keep yourself feeling safe? So when you don't feel safe, you get defensive. So what do you need to do for yourself so then you can have this conversation authentically? And lastly, the intersection of these all of these questions, how can you be safe and live your values at work? And I want to be clear, being safe is not always the same as being comfortable. You might be really uncomfortable and be safe. I want to invite you to really dig into this work. Start practicing with a colleague you feel safe with, a question you might start with, and with a colleague, it's just something like, hey, how do you think you became biased, prejudiced, or racist? How did these thoughts, these feelings, these experiences get inside of you? What were you exposed to? Another question, if that feels too risky, might be something like, what makes you feel safe at work? What makes you feel excited about diversity? And just start having the conversation so it doesn't feel like it's off the table. It doesn't feel like it's wrong. We've all been taught in our history that to be a good person is not to talk about politics and religion and race in the workforce. While that might have made sense in the past, it is clear as our country becomes more evolved and we become better at connecting that we're going to have to be more honest and open with each other if we're going to have our optimal mental health in our workforce and in our world. Thank you so much for the honor of your time and your attention. There are more workshops that Thrive NYC invites you to check out some really amazing work that's happening out here. So continue to improve, continue to grow. These are our references for today, and you can also access these slides.